Dear students, I just want to know your reaction to the earlier lesson on research design, because when we started with the descriptive design and explanatory design, it was so simple. Although it consists of a number of steps, it was so simple to understand, but in the case of experimental design, a researcher has to understand a number of important components to it, and all these special terms have a specific meaning in sociological studies that use experimental design. And therefore, I am going to explain more about certain terms that are employed in experimental design. While employing experimental design in sociological studies, the researcher must be clear with certain important components of this design. Some of them are dependent variable, independent variable, experimental group and control group. These are the technical terms used in experimental design. First, I will explain to you what we mean by dependent variable. If a variable is assumed to depend on or be caused by another variable, it is called dependent variable. For example, expenditure pattern depends on the economic status of the individual. The second one is independent variable. Independent variable is presumed to cause or determine a dependent variable. For example, gender is an independent variable. Now, what is experimental group? In experiment, a group of subjects to whom an experimental stimuli is administered. This group is called as the experimental group. Control group. A group of subjects to whom no experimental stimulus is administered is called a control group. There are three main criteria for causal relationships in social research, which I explained to you earlier. They explain that the variables must be correlated, the cause takes place before the effect, and the variables are non-spurious. I will explain to you what we mean by spurious relationship and non-spurious relationship. Spurious relationship. Sometimes the relationship between two variables are not genuine. The relationship is negative. For example, getting a PG degree and one's weight are not actually related. It is a spurious relationship. Here we find the relationship spurious. The second one is non-spurious relationship. When there is a possible correlation between two variables, it is non-spurious relationship. For example, ice cream sales and summer season. In the last class, I explained to you three types of evidences. The first type is known as concomitant variation. The investigator could determine whether the assumed effect occurs more frequently among subjects who have exposed to the assumed cause than among those who have not been exposed to it. For example, stomachache and eating mango. After eating mango, an individual suffers from stomachache. Therefore, eating mango precedes stomachache. Similarly, a sociological example might be given. Community clashes are taking place in many areas. There may be a cause to it. Whenever there is a religious festival, due to certain reasons, it results in community clashes. Here, the festival and the social circumstances lead to community clashes. The second one is that Y did not occur before X occurs. Since we are choosing two groups and apply a variable, we have to ascertain its effect on one group. This being the case, the differences in these two groups after exposure of one of them to X can be said to have decisively followed X. The example is again stomachache and mango eating. The cause and effect follows like this. It is not because of stomachache the individual has eaten mango, but it is the other way. Mango eating leads to stomach pain. And similarly, community clashes are not the causes for festivals. It is the other way. Festival conditions sometimes result in community clashes. The evidence of third type is concerned with ruling out other factors as the possible determining conditions of Y, which may be occurred in several ways in an experiment. Such possible conditions are avoided by eliminating factors that have occurred in the past, avoiding contemporaneous events other than the exposure to the experimental variable, maturational or developmental changes in the subjects of the experiment, and the influence of the measurement process itself. For easier understanding, the experimental design is explained in the following manner. There are two main types of experimental design: after only experimental design and before after experimental design. In the after only experimental design, the conditions follow like this. We have two groups, experimental group and control group. There is no before measurement for experimental group and also for control group. Regarding exposure to experimental variable, for experimental group it is yes, but for control group it is no. The third condition is exposure to uncontrolled variable. For both the groups it is yes. The last condition is measurement after the experiment, which is yes for both the groups. In after only experiment, the measurement is not done before the researcher starts it. It has been assumed that both the groups are same in all qualities. Once the experiment is over, we do not know whether the difference is either due to initial difference or due to the exposure. Hence, in the before after experiment, the groups are measured both before and after the experiment. There are four different types of before after experiment. 1. Before after experiment with a single group. 2. Before after experiment with one control group. 3. Before after with two control groups. The fourth one, before after experiment with 3 control groups. This design, that is the before after experimental design, has certain advantages over after only experimental design. The first one is it increases the sensitivity of the experiment. Measurement before the experiment makes it possible to determine the incidence of change in the dependent variable and to consider it in evaluating the result. 2. In case the issue under study has a hypothesis specifying the initial condition on the dependent variable, then measurement is essential to test the hypothesis. 3. It increases the confidence that a difference found on after measurement is definitely due to the effect of experimental variables. There are few more types of experimental design. There are different types of experiments conducted according to the needs and appropriateness to the hypothesis to be studied. These types may be explained in the following way. The classical experimental design. The classical experimental design is the basic form of experimental design. This design has random assignment, a pre-test and a post-test, an experimental group and a control group. The researcher randomly divides the subjects into two groups and measures their attitude with the questionnaire before starting the experiment. One group watches a violent horror movie and another one non-horror movie as an independent variable. The researcher at the end measures the attitude again. There is another type of experimental design. It is one-shot case study design. In this design, only one group of subjects is used for the experiment. In this group, the experimental variable is applied on the group and then this group is post-tested. The weakness of the design is that the researcher cannot ascertain the effect on the subjects as no pre-test was done. The weakness of the design is that the researcher cannot ascertain the effect of the experimental variable on the subjects as no pre-test was done. The next one is static group comparison. This design has two groups, a post-test and treatment. It lacks a pre-test and random assignment. On one group, the independent variable is applied, while on the other group it is not. At the end, both the groups are asked to complete a questionnaire to prove the effect of the variable. But again, in this design, the researcher cannot conclude for definite that the effect was due to the variable introduced, since no pre-test was done. The next one is interrupted time series. In interrupted time series, the researcher uses one group and makes multiple tests. He measures the group before and after treatment. The next is the equivalent time series. An equivalent time series design is also an one group design that is being extended over a time period. Instead of using two groups or testing pre and post experiment, the single group selected is tested over a period, maybe in a gap of 1 month or even a year. The time lapse could be decided by the nature of the study. Now, I will explain to you the conditions of the before-after experiment with a single group. This is a diagram given by Celtis in his book. On the one side, we have the condition, on the other side, it is the experimental group. Before measurement, yes. Exposure to experimental variable, yes. Exposure to uncontrolled events, yes. After measurement is also yes. This may be explained in a different way, that is, the experimental group is exposed to before measurement, the experimental group is exposed to experimental factor, the experimental group is exposed to the uncontrolled events, and also the experimental group is measured after the experiment. Now, the explanation is followed with the before after study with one control group. Here also we have the condition, then experimental group 1, then experimental group 2. Under condition we have before measurement. For both the groups it is yes. The second condition is exposure to experimental variable. For the first group it is yes, for the second group it is no. The third condition is exposure to uncontrolled events. For both the groups it is yes. Lastly, measurement after the experiment, it is yes for both the groups. A comparison of these three designs may be presented in the following manner. The objective of exploratory design is to get insight into new problems or areas, whereas the objective of descriptive and diagnostic design is to describe a phenomena. In the case of experimental design, it is to develop a cause and effect relationship. While talking about the characteristic features of the design, for exploratory design, it is a flexible design. The descriptive design is well developed and planned. It has a definite structure. In the case of experimental design, it involves manipulation of one or more variables. Lastly, about the methodology, the exploratory design, non-probability sampling, no pre-planned analysis techniques, expert survey, secondary data or case study, descriptive and diagnostic design, probability sampling, pre-planned, primary and secondary data. In the case of experimental design, it has a well defined sampling plan, experiments under controlled or natural conditions are conducted. Different types of designs are available for social investigators. They have to choose one among them that will suit the research problem to be analyzed. The researcher must opt for the most appropriate design that will yield good result to the research question he is trying to study. We have come to the end of the experimental design, and I would like to sum up and repeat what we studied under research design earlier, that is in the previous class. A research design is a map or plan developed to guide the researcher. It is a blueprint for collection, measurement and analysis of data. It primarily addresses the following questions. Why is the study being conducted? What is the study about? When will the study be carried out? Where will the study be conducted? What is the kind of data required? Where is the data available? What is the technique to be adopted for collecting data? What is the method of data collection? And what is the method of data analysis? What is the sampling method? What is the method of reporting? All these questions are thought of and decided in advance while preparing the design itself. I have explained few designs that are followed frequently in social research. They are the descriptive design, the exploratory design, the diagnostic design and the experimental design. Under experimental design, we studied about two important designs, the before after experimental design and the after only experimental design. I am sure students, now you have got a very clear idea about the designs that are employed in sociological research. Now students, I have two questions for you to answer. They are: question number 1, explain after only experimental design. Question 2, what is before after experimental design? Discuss its advantages over after only experimental design. Bye students, we will meet in the next class.